Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Dr. Andrew Rabin is a professor of the English at the University of Louisville, where he teaches courses on medieval law and literature. He's the author of 7 books and numerous articles. His work has been featured on NPR and Slate.com. He's been cited in such publications as History Today, The Atlantic Monthly, and The Washington Post. Professor Rabin is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Rabin.
All right. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I'm really thrilled to hear that you're going to be doing Rope in a couple of weeks. Rope is, of course, it is as the source for the Hitchcock film, but it's also based on one of the most famous murders of the 1920s, Leopold and Loeb. So it's going to be a real treat, I'm sure. So yes, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out this evening. What better way to spend a dark midwinter evening than with thoughts of gory death, right? I mean, we love this, right? We spend our time with Sherlock Holmes in 221B Baker Street, or we may visit with Hercule Poirot and his mustaches, Miss Marple in St. Mary Mead, or perhaps you prefer the aristocracy with Lord Peter Wimsey, or you want to wander the dark streets of Los Angeles with Raymond Chandler's Marlowe. Of course, there are also people who prefer their murders to be a bit more realistic. So we have the father of them all, Jack the Ripper. Or you might prefer Lizzie Borden, who took an axe and gave her parents 40 whacks. Or you might like yours singing, in which case, if you want a real murderer singing, there is always Aaron Burr, sir. And of course, what fan of public television doesn't have an almost Pavlovian response when they see this image? Which is, of course, sponsored by viewers like you. We're all members of what the great 19th century essayist Thomas de Quincey called the Society of Connoisseurs in Murder. Murder is the most ghastly of crimes, yet for some reason we just can't get enough of it. Perhaps because the stakes are so high, perhaps because it is the most exciting, the most important of crimes. The simple fact of the matter is there's no television show called NCIS Shoplifting, right? Murder really is, as Thomas de Quincey says, one of the fine arts. He writes that something more goes into the composition of a fine murder than just 2 blockheads to kill and be killed, a knife, a purse, and a dark lane. Design, grouping, light and shade, poetry, sentiment are now deemed indispensable to attempts of this nature. We want our murders to fascinate us. We expect them to be like a poem or a painting or a story. Unfortunately, De Quincey also wrote something else. The art of murder was lost in the Dark Ages for lack of encouragement. What? Our goal over the next 4 weeks is to just show how wrong De Quincey can be. Our course is going to look at not just great murders, but also what those murders tell us about the world in which they transpired. How can we learn about the fascinating, diverse, multifarious world of the English Middle Ages through the lens of its most serious crime? So today, we're going to be covering homicide for fun and profit. We're going to look what homicide looked like in real life. What was your sort of average homicide like? How was it investigated? How was it adjudicated? So that's today. Next week, politics can be murder. We're going to look at political assassination. We're going to focus especially on 2 of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the Middle Ages: the murder of King Edward the Martyr in the 10th century and the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower in the 15th. From there, we will go on to killing saints and killer saints. Of course, it always takes a great, someone's a great saint if they've been martyred. But in the Middle Ages, you also had saints who were not just the victims of murder, but also its perpetrators. One of the big murders we're going to be looking at for that class is the murder of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral, a particularly bloody and gory one. And finally, we will end with things that go bump in the night. Not all murderers are human. I'd tell you more, but I don't want to give it away. So yes, that's the plan for the next 4 weeks. First, a preliminary, though. What are we talking about when we talk about medieval England? It's important to sort of get our dates down. Typically, when we talk about medieval England, we mean the period between roughly 500 and 1500. It begins just after the fall of the Roman Empire and the withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain, with the arrival of several tribes of Germanic settlers who establish on the island of Britain roughly 7 separate kingdoms. They're related culturally, but they're all separate politically. And they're all governed basically by local regional lords or regional kings. Now, in 596, you have the arrival of Roman missionaries in Britain to start the conversion from paganism to Christianity. Roman missionaries bring with them, among other things, the technology of writing. So not only is the advent of Christianity in Britain the marker of a major historical and cultural shift, it also marks the origin of written law in England. Now, over the course of the next 350 years or so, those 7 kingdoms will gradually, under pressure of the Viking invasions, meld into the single nation that we now know of as England. And that'll, of course, take place under the rules of Alfred the Great, his son Edward the Elder, and his grandson Ethelstan the Great. By the time we hit 1066, the most important and most memorable year in English history, Anglo-Saxon England will have the most effective, centralized legal administration in Europe. It is, in most ways, a kingdom in the modern sense of the word, with courts and instruments of rule that we would recognize. Now, of course, this all goes to hell in 1066, with the conquest of England by a fellow who was known in his own time as Duke William the Bastard, both because he was illegitimate and because he was a real bastard. William comes to England from Normandy. His goal is to elevate himself from just being a mere duke to actually being something much more prestigious, a king. Over the course of the second half of the English Middle Ages, we see the transition of England from not just an effectively governed state, but actually taking its first steps to becoming a world power. It's during this period especially that in the year 1215, we have King John issuing Magna Carta, the foundation for our notion of legal rights that influenced the American Declaration of Independence and the development of modern English law, something we'll talk about later. We also have the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, which we'll talk about more next time. And it ends in 1485 with the death of Richard III on the battlefield, on Bosworth battlefield. We'll talk about him more next time also. So that when we talk about the Middle Ages, that's more or less what we're talking about. We have this fantasy in our head of the Middle Ages as being a period that is especially brutal, especially savage, right? Medieval is a term that we use as a substitute for violence. It's a sort of code word for a world that has gone chaotic, a world that is, well, where we've regressed to a world without law, which means we have to ask an important question. Just how murderous were the Middle Ages? Well, statistics are always a sort of tricky thing to deal with, but we do have some. So, in London, there are about 142 documented homicides between 1300 and 1340, so a 40-year period. Now, if we compare that with Roanoke, Virginia, which has roughly the same population as medieval London, it had 306 documented homicides between 1985 and 2014. Now, if we take London in 1300, it has an estimated 20 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. New Orleans in 2022, which is the highest murder rate in the United States, 58.4 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. San Jose, California, the lowest murder rate, 3.6 murders per 100,000. The US average is 6.3 murders per 100,000. But none of those, I think, are the most interesting statistic. Remember it says here, London at 1,300, 20 murders per 100,000? Louisville in 2022, 20 murders per 100,000. That sure makes you feel good walking the streets. Of course, the most violent community in England was, not surprisingly, Oxford, with a whopping 75 murders per 100,000. It makes sense when you think about it. Oxford is filled with a bunch of violent, drunken college students. Go Cards! Now, as I said, statistics are always a bit unreliable. Of course, during the Middle Ages, there were probably numerous murders that we don't know about simply because they went undocumented. So perhaps there were certainly far more murders than we know about today. At the same time, advances in medical technology mean that wounds that would be fatal in the Middle Ages today might not even merit a trip to the emergency room. So the comparison of statistics is actually pretty rough, but it does allow us to say two really important things. First, that fantasy of the Middle Ages being this sort of crazy, violent, bloodthirsty, murderous time is really an exaggeration. These were not the Dark Ages, a phrase that I hope you never use, and for my students in the audience, if I ever hear you use it in class, that's a quick way to an F. Also, murder was rare enough in the Middle Ages that people treated it with the same kind of horror, the same kind of fear that we do today. People did not become inured to murder. Nobody walked down the street and said, oh, well, there goes Orderic, another guy down the drain, right? Murder was something to be feared, but also, like today, murder was something with which to be fascinated. So let's take a look at what people actually thought about murder. And we're going to start right at the sort of first half, the Anglo-Saxon period. And we're actually going to start right at the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period with the very first code of law to be issued in England, which is also, interestingly, the very first surviving document to actually be written in English. So we're going right back not just to the origins of law or the origins of the kingdom, but also to the origins of the language that we still speak. The first law code to be issued in Britain was issued by the King of Kent, one of the small kingdoms, Ethelbert. One of the great things about being an Anglo-Saxon is you get to talk about people with names like Ethelbert. We're going to get some great ones over the next 4 weeks. So here are just a couple of laws that Ethelbert has about homicide. If one man slays another, the typical penalty to be paid shall be 100 shillings. If a man slays the dependent of a commoner, so a servant, he shall pay the commoner 6 shillings as compensation. So not only does he have to pay for the person who was killed, but also an additional 6 shillings to the person responsible for that person or who benefited from their labor. If one man slays another on the king's premises, he shall pay 50 shillings to the king as compensation. There are a couple of things that are important about laws like these and tell us something important about the way in which law worked in the Middle Ages. First, notice that murder isn't just murder. There are all sorts of conditions that might make a murder more serious or less serious. So, for instance, social status. Somebody who is higher status is worth more, you pay more in weregild, in man price, than you would for somebody of lower status. Location. If you slay somebody on the king's premises, you've not only violated that person's, health, rights, well-being, you've also insulted the authority of the king, which exacerbates the seriousness of the crime. Now, the other thing to notice here is that all of the penalties here are financial penalties. And there's a reason for that. The early Middle Ages was a world of feud, right? I mean, it was a period where, especially at this very early period, when you don't yet have centralized governance, if somebody offends my family, if somebody kills my uncle, if somebody drops a tree on my house or, a house on my witch, I will typically take the law into my own hands and try to go and basically get revenge. The king wants to avoid that. The king is trying to introduce a more settled, a more peaceful, a more governed kingdom, which means the king doesn't want to exacerbate violence. The king wants to find ways of lessening violence. Financial penalties are a way of doing that. In fact, these financial penalties go so far that in the laws of Ethelbert, you see very, very specific penalties for damage to each part of the body. A finger, a toe, the little finger versus the big finger. Rock and roll. A knee, the testicles, the front tooth, a back tooth, all keyed into how valuable or how important that particular body part happened to be. They had ways of judging that importance. One of my favorite laws to survive from the Middle Ages. If somebody shall receive a head wound, in order to determine how serious that head wound is, on one side of the road shall be placed a shield. On the other side of the road, the victim's relatives shall stand with the piece of bone that was chipped out of the skull. They shall throw the bone across the road. If you can hear the plink in the shield, it's a more serious wound. No plink, less serious. I kind of picture there being like professional bone throwers, right? Like arms for the major league. I'm going to make sure you hear this. Now, the next thing to notice here is that capital punishment is not a penalty. For all of our sort of image of the Middle Ages as a period in which people are getting executed left and right for the most major, the most minor of crimes, in fact, courts were tremendously wary of capital punishment for very good reasons. One reason is simply that a court sentencing somebody to death is a violation of biblical law, the law that says that only God holds the power of life and death. More immediately, if I'm on a jury or if I'm a judge, I'm very worried that I might not get something right. If I convict somebody to the most final of penalties and I'm wrong, I've committed a mortal sin. I've just damned my soul in hellfire forever. In fact, the idea of reasonable doubt originates in the early Middle Ages not as a way of protecting a defendant, but actually as a way of allowing juries to determine which of their doubts are reasonable ones and should be grounds for letting a person off for a lower penalty, and which doubts are them just being worried about conviction. So in fact, the death penalty is a lot less common during this period than you might expect. Now, one of the great things about Wehrgild is that we actually have some great images of somebody chopping somebody up and then Wehrgild being paid for that person. So we actually can see that this is something that was not only part of the medieval imagination, but it actually worked, or at least took place in practice. Now, the other really, really important thing to bear in mind here is that we think of the law, the goal of the law, as protecting individual rights. But that's not necessarily how the law was seen in the Middle Ages. The purpose of the law in the Middle Ages was to ensure the coherence and the order of communities. A crime during this period is not just a crime against a person, it's a rupture in the life of the community, which means that the adjudication process's purpose, by saying that 5 times fast, the adjudication process's purpose is not necessarily just to punish somebody or to expel somebody from the community. The goal is to heal the rupture in the community. And there's actually a phrase that turns up in a number of early disputes that says, essentially, then the court decreed that it would be better for the oath, that is, the oath that causes a dispute to go to court or to somebody to be actually punished, to be dispensed with. Because after it, once that oath has been sworn, there can be no friendship. Once you go to court, you can never go back. court may adjudicate, but it does not necessarily work to heal. Which means that really the disputes that actually make it to court are relatively rare, and they're the ones that really no other settlement, no other compromise can be found to resolve. Now, how do we know about court cases during this period? At this early period, there's no such thing as a formal court report. So if you're involved in a dispute, whether it's a criminal dispute or a civil dispute, in fact, the person responsible for producing the court record is you. So most of our court records look something, we're not there yet. There we go. Look something like this, right? This is a royal charter delegating or assigning a set of lands to somebody the king wants to reward. Most of our criminal cases survive as part of a land record. The idea is that the real purpose of a record is not just to record an event, it's a document of memory. The idea is that you're not looking backwards at a crime that was committed, you're looking forwards at how to respond to crime and how to deal with land tenure in the future. So the goal is not just to say, this thing happened and I won. The goal is to be able to say, this is how you should remember this event. This is how I, as the victor, want you to remember this event. Not only so that you know that I was in the right and somebody else was in the wrong, but also so that you know that I, as the person who gained land or wealth because of this event, I hold that title free and clear, and nobody else can dispute it. Now, how important were the production of these charters? This manuscript is the Hereford Gospels. It's in Hereford Cathedral. It's one of the most magnificent early medieval Bibles that you can see. Now, this is the very last page of the Gospels. Right here, a disputant, a litigant, actually got permission from the bishop to inscribe the record of his court case right next to the Gospels in the Bible. He's ensuring that we are going to remember how that case transpired. Now, if we jump to the later period, there we go. Now we're going to jump to the laws of Canute. So these are the last set of laws issued in Anglo-Saxon England. We're only about 45 years before the conquest now. By this point, the kingdom is centralized. The king is in a very strong governing position. And so the way in which murder is treated is quite different. Now we say that murder, which cannot be denied, is a crime for which no compensation can be paid. So we've gone from saying it's important to use compensation as a means of resolving murder to saying murder is so serious that you can't compensate for it. However, what does that actually mean? Well, let's take the murder of one of the most important members of a community. If anyone slays a priest, he shall be both excommunicated and outlawed unless he makes amends through pilgrimage. So even if you slay a priest, you're still not actually necessarily being put to death. You're being removed from society, but there's still an anxiety about actually killing you. If an accusation of murder is brought and the accused fails to clear himself, the bishop shall pronounce judgment. So if somebody's accused of murder, and the accusers can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person did it, but the person also can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he didn't do it, then it's up to the bishop to determine where culpability lies and how serious that culpability is. So you see there again evidence that they're really concerned about getting law right, and that they're developing procedures for those cases in which culpability or guilt is unclear. Finally, if anyone commits a grievous crime, like murder, the punishment must be justifiable in the sight of God and acceptable in the eyes of men. So how do you determine what is a just judgment? It's one that adheres to the authority of God. Even if you are the king, you can't punish just because of your own absolute power. You have to punish in accordance with the law of God. And your punishments, whether you're a king or a judge, have to be found just and acceptable by the community. So it's important to note here that at this stage, law is not just the sort of the unchecked exercise of power. Law is something that relates to the entirety of the body politic, and everybody has an investment in law being done right. All right, so what then does an actual murder look like during this period? Well, let's take a look at one. The murder we're going to look at actually is from the year 1020. So it's right at the same period as these laws are being issued. And we're going to call this murder, there we go, Murder in the House of Thurkill. Thurkill is a local regional lord. He is one of the wealthier individuals in the community, but not of the highest status. Thurkill lives in his house with his second wife and the infant child of his first wife. Now, we're told in the record, which survives in actually not a charter, but in a medieval ecclesiastical chronicle, which is going to be important a little later on. We are told that first, in the elements of the crime, seized with jealousy, Edith, Thurkill's second wife, murders his infant son. Then, with the aid of a witch, and the word witch is really interesting there, we think of witch, of course, as like the witch burnings of the 17th century. In this early period, a witch is probably the local wise woman, which is actually not a crime. That's just, every community had one. So it's possible the local wise woman, or it's maybe just an elderly female servant in her household. But either way, with the aid of a witch, Edith buries the body in a nearby field. Then, furious at not being paid, the witch approaches the Earl Ethelrich, who is, he's the Earl, he's the most important local aristocrat. He's the one who has regional power. She approaches the Earl Ethelrich and reports the crime. So she tells him that this crime has taken place. Ethelric does then what a lord is supposed to do. He reports the crime to the local shire court, which summons Thurkill, who refuses to appear before the court. Thurkill will refuse to appear for three times after 3 summonses, at which point Ethelric notifies the king. Now, one of the great things about this moment is this actually conforms directly with written law of the period. So right here we have confirmation of the way in which law is written down in a law code actually being put into practice. So after 3 summonses, Ethelric notifies the king, who compels Thurkill to appear before the court. And Thurkill and Edith are each ordered to produce 11 oath helpers. An oath helper is basically a character witness, right? Somebody who can swear, Edith is such a great woman, she would never kill a baby. Thurkill is such a great guy, he would never be party to the murder of his infant son. Of course, if you're a popular guy, it's not that hard to find people who will swear on your behalf. But nonetheless, you need your character to be verified. It needs to be shown that you are what was called oath-worthy. That is, you are somebody who is worthy to take an oath. So the court then convenes in the field where the body is buried. And this is an important thing, right? We're not convening in a courtroom or in some sort of neutral space. It's important that the adjudication of justice takes place at the scene of the crime, or at least in this sense, at the scene right after the crime, but where the body is, right? We can only do justice. We can only heal the community in the very space where the rupture in the community took place. Now then, Thurkill goes and swears upon holy relics that have been brought by the bishop. He swears upon holy relics that he's innocent of the crime. Relics, and we're going to talk about these more when we get to our murderous saints, right? Relics are some of the most important objects in the medieval world. They're not just special objects. They're even more important or more powerful than a Bible. They are the body parts of saints. And saints are figures who have one leg in this world, one leg in the next. They are the connectors in our world with God. So when you are swearing on holy relics, this is about the most serious oath you can make. One of the punishments for perjury is actually the hand that you swore on the relics with has to get chopped off. The very hand itself that has committed the violation has to be punished. So he swears on the holy relics that he is innocent of the crime, which of course is a pretty easy oath for him to swear because he didn't actually kill the baby. It's going to be a bit harder for Edith. So to save his wife from having to take the oath, Thurkel swears upon his beard. You notice we're not talking about the relics anymore. He swears upon his beard that she's innocent. But when he does so, when he yanks his beard or touches his beard to make the oath, it's sort of unclear what happens here. Whether it says hairs from the beard that actually hair comes off his face, or that actually his beard mysteriously or miraculously falls out. It's important that the text actually be a bit ambiguous here. Because, of course, what we're looking at is not just an exercise of human justice, but also justice is one of the ways in which God intervenes in the world. This is a period when one of the ways of adjudicating violations, adjudicating crimes, is through the use of the ordeal, which is essentially divine judgment. Now, one of the important things about the ordeal that I think is relevant here, too, is that the ordeal was never used as a discovery procedure, right? Nobody's saying, all right, we need to figure out who stole this golden cup, so everybody go stick their hand in a tub of boiling water, and we'll figure out which one of you is the guilty one. The ordeal is actually only used when you're pretty sure that you know who the guilty person is. And of course, when you're dealing with small communities that perhaps have 25 or 30 households at the most, you don't have too many mysteries. It's generally pretty obvious who committed a crime. So it's hard to say here, are we looking at something miraculous? Or is this a sign that everybody was sitting there like, oh yeah, Thurkel, you can swear all you want. We know what really happened. Your beard's fallen out for that, right? Like Pinocchio, your nose is starting to grow. So yeah, that doesn't work out so well. But Edith continues to deny her guilt. So the bishop orders the baby's secret tomb is to be opened, and confronted with the body, Edith confesses. The most important type of evidence is the evidence of the body of the victim. And this is something that we are going to see replicated over and over again, right? The body of the saint is important. The body of the victim here is important. And when Edith is confronted with the body, she can no longer deny her crime. She confesses. Now, this is such a horrible crime. What kind of penalty would they receive? Well, Thurkel is convicted of perjury, his wife of murder, and they are banished. So even for the killing of an infant, they're not actually put to death. They're sent away from the community, but they're not killed. And how do we know all of this? Well, another part of the penalty is that Thurkel's lands are given to the church. Where does this record survive? In a church chronicle. So this event is recorded in part because it's a pretty crazy story, but also because it's necessary for the church to demonstrate that they have a right to these lands. Now, there's another aspect of the story that's pretty important also. On the one hand, this is a record of an event, right? This is a historical record. We can identify Thurkel, we can identify Edith. We know this happened, and it happened more or less in the way in which it's described here. But did it strike anybody that this is also a different kind of story? It's a fairy tale, right? We have an evil stepmother. We have a witch. We have a hero who is so full of pride that he takes one foolish step that brings him and his family to ruin. It's important that this not just be a dry record, but also an engaging, almost magical narrative, right? As a moment in history in which God has intervened, God always brings magic and miracle with him. So the story that tells of this court case itself has to have magic, itself has to be something special, right? Also, stories confirm other stories. If I want you to believe the story that I am telling, I'm going to tell you a story that in your head is going to register as true because it resonates with other narratives. We all know stepmothers are evil. We're all a little nervous about witches. We've all seen that person who's like, oh yeah, I can do this, and then totally fails. We all know this story. And so how do we know that this is a reliable record, that things here actually happened? It's verified by the fact that we know stories just like this. And what's important here, and this gets right back to that idea of court records as memorial documents, right? What's important here is not just the event or the adjudication of the event. What's important here is the way in which the story of the event is told. The justice of the adjudication, the righteousness of the penalty, those are validated by the fact that it occurs in a good, legitimate, reliable story. So that's what murder looks like in the early Middle Ages. Let's jump ahead now to after the conquest. Now, there's a major legal change in England after the conquest, and it's the development of something that we call the common law, which remains the foundation of both US law and British law. And what the common law is essentially law based on precedent. So if you think about the way in which cases are argued before the Supreme Court, right? Before the Supreme Court, you don't argue facts. You say, okay, here's this legal problem. One lawyer is going to say, all right, you should decide this case in this way because these 5 cases were decided in that way beforehand. The other lawyer says, no. Those precedents, those aren't as good, those aren't as reliable as these 5 precedents that I'm going to use. Law is determined in that sense, not so much by statute, but by practice. And that has an effect on the way in which laws are written. So here we have some laws from 1166, the laws of Henry II, also the fellow we're going to encounter when he's busy killing off Thomas Becket. So, in the first place, King Henry has decreed that inquests, courts, shall be made of 12 of the more lawful men of the country, not the lawful men, just the more lawful men. So, right, we have the jury there. If in that county there is any man who has been charged as being a robber or a murderer or a thief, the justices shall make this court by themselves. So, it's the justice's job to compose a formal court. And when that murderer, robber, or thief is arrested, if the assigned justices are not able to come quickly enough into that county, the sheriff shall send word to the nearest justice, the judge, in the next town over, through some intelligent man. Don't rely on a moron. Through some intelligent man, and the sheriff shall bring the accused before that justice, and with them they shall bring 2 lawful men to bear record on the part of the county and the hundred, basically the region, as to why they were taken. And there, before the justice, they shall do their law. Note that the focus of this law is not don't murder or don't steal. The focus of this law is what are the proper procedures to ensure that we are responding to this crime in a just, authoritative, and legitimate way. So the statute of this period, it's not about saying something's legal or something's illegal. It's more about saying, how is the court supposed to work in order to deal with this problem? Now, how do we know about the murders of the later period? Well, now we actually start having official court documents, and they're preserved in the form of what are called pipe rolls, which are quite literally rolls. These are all preserved in the English National Archives in Somerset House in London. And one of the really amazing things about them is that there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them. Not all of them have been edited. Not all of them have been read. So one of the great things is that as people study the pipe rolls, new information, new things about the Middle Ages are always coming to pass. In fact, just about 2 years ago, a brand new sort of moment in the life of Chaucer was revealed by a court case preserved in one of these pipe rolls. Now, the fact that these are official documents in the way that the charters of the early Middle Ages weren't, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that these are somehow more objective, that these are somehow more legitimate or more authorized. As with any kind of legal document, the goal here is not just to report the events that it concerns. The goal here is to ensure that anybody reading that document knows that that event was dealt with in a lawful manner, and that the government or the court that dealt with it had the authority to do so. So these records are not just about keeping a record of something, they're also about ensuring that people know that the government of England and the courts that administer the law of England have the authority to do so, have the legitimacy to do so. So just as those earlier records were all about validating my right to land, these later records are all about validating the rightfulness of the court and the rightfulness of the government. All right, so let's look at a murder. Let's take a look, we're going to call this one a murder in Cripplegate. Cripplegate is a neighborhood in London. And we're actually going to look at the actual document here, the words of the actual document. So, on the Thursday after the feast of St. Andrew the Apostle, which is 30th of November, 1315, the coroner and sheriffs received information that John de Minimes, an innkeeper, had been found dead at a house in Sylvester Street in the parish of St. Olave, Cripplegate. Right? So, this record starts not with the crime, but actually the reporting of the crime. So the moment when the law gets involved in this dispute. And we're told that the court made their way there to the place of the crime and impaneled a jury from Cripplegate and the four neighboring wards, namely Aldersgate, Farringdon, with Farringdon within, Bassishaw, and Cheap, and also Vintry, where the dead man was reported to have been wounded. Notice that the same thing is happening here as happened in that court case from the earlier period. Where do you adjudicate crime? You adjudicate crime at the place where the crime occurred. So if this person was found murdered in this case, in his inn, where does the court take place? At the inn. Where is the jury pulled from? The neighborhood, right? The people who are part of this community. So, the jury found, and notice it's important here, the jury found, right, this is all about what has been determined by the rightful process of law. The jury found that on the Tuesday of the Feast of St. Martin, which was 11 November, and notice that the crime took place on the 11th of November, but it only makes it to the court by the 30th. People are not necessarily that into reporting things to the police. So, some things haven't changed. John de Minimes had been in Upper Thames Street, opposite the church of St. Martin Vintry. Nicholas Borstal, servant to Richard of Bluntisham, together with Richard's brother John, approached him. So what are the actual circumstances of the crime? When angry words were exchanged, Nicholas drew a sword called a misericord and struck John on the right hand, slicing off 2 of his fingers. He then inflicted a wound on the left side of John's head, 1 inch long and half an inch deep. So there are a couple of interesting things just about this statement. One of them, Nicholas drew a sword called a misericord. Right? The fact that it's this kind of sword is not necessarily relevant to the actual crime. We're not told what kind of knife Edith used to kill the baby. But it's important, in order to ensure the legitimacy of this record, we have to preserve all details. Also, while this is seemingly a more objective record than, say, the one of the crime of Edith, note that one of the similarities is we're really interested in mindset and motive. Edith, we were told she did what she did because she was seized with jealousy. Here, angry words were exchanged, right? This was a crime born of anger, born of a street brawl. Why did it happen? Because of violence in the street. There's also a real concern with the specificities of the wound, right? We have a wound that was cut off 2 fingers of the right hand. He then inflicted a wound on the left side of John's head, 1 inch long and 1.5 inches deep. Half an inch deep. I added an extra inch there. Sorry, John. What we're seeing here is actually we're investigating the body. The evidence of the body remains crucial. And you actually have coroners whose job it is to know human anatomy, and to engage in the very sorts of actions and behaviors that modern coroners do. What transpired on this body? It's important that we know what kind of wounds and how they were afflicted. How deep are they? How long are they? What are the biological consequences of those wounds? Once again, the body of the victim is the most important thing. In fact, bodies were so important that people who reported crimes were actually penalized if they moved a body. So if the court comes to the place of the crime and there's the body sort of lying out there, and somebody's like, well, he was killed in this other room, but I wanted him to be more visible, the court's actually going to penalize you for that because you changed the evidence. So, after this, the innkeeper's friends carried him to the house on Sylvester Street, where he languished until the Thursday after the Feast of St. Andrews, when he died of his wounds. So, why is there this long delay? Well, part of it is he's not dead yet. Sounds like a Monty Python song. I'm not dead yet. Murder in musicals. Sweeney Todd. So he lingers for a while. He's only reported when we're sure that this guy was, in fact, a victim of murder. There were no suspects apart from Nicholas of Borstal and John of Bluntisham, so clearly there has been an investigation that has been reported to the court. After the crime had been committed, Nicholas was arrested and committed to prison at Newgate, but John ran away, and the jurors did not know where he went or who might be hiding him. Oops. Present at the scene of the crime had been the 3 men and others whose names were unknown to the jury. John of Bluntisham had no goods or chattels as far as they could determine. So who was present? Why aren't both suspects in court? But also, what status is John of Bluntisham here? Is he an important figure or not so much? Well, he doesn't have any property. When the corpse was viewed, again, this is the entire court, this is that entire jury huddled around this body. When the corpse was viewed, the head wound and the loss of 2 fingers from the right hand were observed. So it's not just important to keep a record of the murder or a record of the wounds on the body, everybody has to be able to see them. And the importance of the body, right, it persists today, not just in terms of investigation, the discovery of evidence, but one of the hardest, one of the greatest obstacles to gaining a murder conviction is if there's no body. So that idea of viewing the body is just as important to us today as it was back in the Middle Ages. So, what can we say about murders of the period? What sort of brings them all together, or at least brings the ones that we've discussed together? Well, I think these are the really important salient points. First, in both cases, we have the importance of the crime scene. Right? In both cases, we have this idea we have to go to the place where the wrong was done, where the rightful order of things has been disrupted. Of course, this is something that we still associate with murders. One of the things that makes, say, Mysteries by Agatha Christie so compelling and so enjoyable is that they're all about the disruption of a generally pretty perfect community. So think like St. Mary Mead in the Miss Marple stories. The murder takes place. What's our goal? We have to find the murderer and restore the peace of the community so that the community at the end of the mystery is a better community, a more secure community, a healed community, as opposed to the community at the beginning. So we still have that idea of the importance of the crime scene. And likewise, the emphasis on the body of the victim. Now, we often say about the Middle Ages, well, they didn't know science back then like we do, which is, of course, complete garbage. They didn't understand human anatomy, right? You weren't supposed to, understand what went on in people's bodies. Actually, you did. And there were people whose job it was to do that. And so when you're dealing with murder, you're actually engaged in the very serious search for evidence. And the basic source of that is the investigator's knowledge of the human body. The importance of the motive or mindset of the accused. We talked today about a murder having 3 components: means, motive, and opportunity. Means we've seen. He used a sword called a misericord. Opportunity, right? Well, she's the mother in the house. Motive is just as important. We don't just need to know what happened. We actually need to know the psychology of those involved. The importance of eyewitness testimony, right? There needs to be people who can come before the court and say, I saw this happen, right? It's not just about physical evidence, it's also about human evidence, whether it's the old lady reporting the crime to Earl Ethelric, whether it's, who are these people who are standing around in the inn watching this happen? When we think about building a body of evidence for a conviction, it's not just about the body, you also need human verification. There's a real concern about the fairness of judgment. Again, we think of medieval England as essentially a tyranny, right? Where an absolute monarch can, on his own whim, do whatever he wants. But that was very much not the case. There's a real concern with making sure that when we deal with a crime, when we deal with this murder, we do it in the most just, the most legitimate, and most valid way as possible. There's a phrase that comes down to us from the Middle Ages that we still use today, and you may have heard it, that when you talk about a nation, it's a nation of laws, not of men. And in that model, the king himself is also subject to the law. And what that means is that the king is bound by the rules of justice, just like his representatives, just like anybody else. We also see that there is a real concern about the use of the death penalty, right? There are lots of serious punishments available to us, but we're really, really nervous about the most severe of them. Finally, what's most important is the way we tell the story. We have to tell the story in a way that makes sense, that ensures that anyone who reads it believes and is confident that the crime has been dealt with in a lawful fashion, that there is an authority whose responsibility is to deal with it, and that authority has acted rightly. We have to ensure that that record shapes the memory of the event, so that when we look back on that event, right, we remember it in the way in which it was narrated, in the way in which the story was told to us, whether it's a story in a church chronicle or a story in a pipe roll. The most important part of a murder, whether you're talking about Arthur Conan Doyle or you're talking about a crime that takes place in the street, the most important part of a murder is how we tell the story. So that is how murder was understood in the Middle Ages. Next week, politics can be murder. At same medieval bat time, same medieval bat channel. Thank you very much. And I believe we have a few minutes for questions. Ooh, okay, somebody's going to walk. Well done.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a few questions. In the case of Edith in 1022,
Yeah, 1020, but yeah, we're around then, but it doesn't matter.
I don't know.
What's a year here or there between friends?
What was the composition of the court? I found it interesting, the progression of the officials involved over time, and I'm just curious what that composition was made of.
It's a great question. So your court during this period, and this is going to be true really throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, your court is not typically going to be made up of a jury of your peers, right? Commoners are not necessarily going to be part of the official adjudication process. There we go. A court is actually going to be overseen by local officials. You're not going to have one judge. You're actually going to have a panel of judges. And those judges might be local lords or important landholders. It's certainly going to involve the bishop or other high-ranking ecclesiastics. But essentially, it's going to be people of high status in the community who will together engage in the adjudication of this crime. Now, you're probably all noticing the big problem here, which is that panel with authority, these are not necessarily disinterested judges. It's not rare for the person who ends up with the criminal's land at the end to magically be one of the judges. Just as today, there are people who take advantage of the court system, and that's, most available to the wealthy.
That kind of leads me into my second question. I was, with your summary list of what the period has in common with the early medieval period and the latter medieval period, it strikes me as very similar to what, many of our own our ideas of the justice system are based on, which we know cannot always be applied equally. And I'm just curious if in the records there are cases where people have been later exonerated or found innocent, or if there were people who, kind of advocated on the behalf of those accused.
So I'll answer those questions separately.
Sorry.
No. Those are both great questions. So to take the first one about exoneration, we actually do have quite a few narratives of exoneration, but it's interesting where they turn up. They don't turn up in charters. Or at least typically we have several sets of charters in which one charter convicts and another charter reveals that the person was convicted wrongly. But in terms of single narratives, where you see exoneration narratives are actually saints' lives. And this is something that we'll see in 2 sessions. But how do you explain the wrongful act of a court or a miscarriage of justice? Well, if the secular authority is inadequate to deal with the crime, fortunately, there's a greater authority that supersedes that of the secular authority, and that authority will intervene and make things right. Now, the next question you had was, what about advocates? And actually, there are advocates in courts of law. So, during the earlier period, these advocates are going to be called forespeka, literally for speakers, the people who speak for someone. And your forespeka is not going to be a professional lawyer, but it may be a patron, it may be an important relative, it may be just somebody in your family who's really good at getting up in front of people and arguing. Once we get to the later period, we start seeing the emergence of a professional legal class. And this is actually a crucial part of the development of the common law. Part of what the common law relies on is the development of a class whose specific job it is to be experts in the law. And so in the 12th century, this is the moment when the English legal profession comes to be. It's the moment when you have the establishment of what are called the Inns of Court, which even today remain the most prestigious and important law schools in England. If you visit London, you can still visit Old Temple and New Temple, Lincoln's Inn Fields. They're really remarkable places. If you ever go to London, absolutely take time to visit them. But this is the moment when you start seeing actual professional advocates who are being paid in a professional way for their duty. Now, I'll add one more thing. One of my most exciting moments as a scholar was working through these court records and actually discovering the very first woman to act as an advocate in a court of law. And it was actually the very first, a woman named Elfthryth, who we'll actually be encountering next session, who was the Queen of England. She was the very first woman to be formally crowned queen. So she's the first woman not just to be like the consort of the king or the lover of the king, but actually to have a formal position in court. And part of that position she saw as entering the court and acting as an advocate. So just sort of an interesting moment. Other questions?
You mentioned that there were judges who had personal stake in the outcome of an event. So I was wondering, with your statement that kings and nobles were held to a sense of duty to God and hence weren't just doing whatever their whim was, do we have any proof of that, or is that just a marketing of the time? Like, yeah, we're all held into account by the same law, but I'm the king.
So actually we do, which is pretty interesting from the later period, but also from the earlier period. Now, obviously, at any point in time, then as now, you have the difference between the ideal and the real. The ideal is, of course, that perfect justice takes place, that the court cannot be corrupted, and the real is that it happens all the time. But we do have instances of the law being enforced in confrontation with seemingly superseding authorities. So actually the case that quotation came from at the beginning, they didn't swear the oath because thereafter there would be no friends. That record begins, it's actually a land dispute, with the dispute being brought by one of the litigants before the king, and the king deciding the dispute, because that litigant actually, she was a noble at court, so he there was, he's playing favorites. The other litigant comes before the king and says, you are not allowed to resolve this dispute. According to appropriate legal process, this dispute is supposed to go to this court, not to the king. And the king's actually forced to yield. And in fact, she then later is forced to compromise. And so that victory she had because of her connection with the king vanishes because of the enforcement of the law in the face of the king.
A bit earlier when you were talking about like how much money would be owed based on all the variety of factors, kind of a two-part question. Where did the money go and what happened if they didn't have the money?
Okay. So, again, a great question. Where did the money go? This changes over the course of the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, at the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period, there's no such distinction between what we would call crime and tort, right? That is, crime, which is a violation of state authority, and tort, which is a violation of individual rights. So pretty much everything was treated as a tort, which means that when you paid that fine, unless there was some sort of special provision, that fine would go to the person or to the family that had been wronged. So the idea was that the fine, which was also referred to as composition, it was supposed to basically compose or recompose, make whole again, that family which had been damaged. Now, what happens if you did not have the money? Well, you always have something to sell, whether it is your land, your property, or your person. If you could not pay the money, you would actually go into slavery. Now, to be honest, I kind of think like, would I really want my brother's murderer as my slave? Like that just like, I don't want that person in my house. But that actually was typically what happened. Other questions?
I'm just curious how often we find corroborations on these. There's the one case you mentioned where, forgive me, my memory for names is atrocious. What was it, Edith and...
Yeah.
When they found that both of them were guilty of crimes, and that because of that, their land was to be deeded to the church. I'm kind of curious just because in my head, like what I know of that time period is pretty much the church is pretty much the only institution that gets land in perpetuity. Everything else is, I'm gifting this to X noble for X amount of time for whatever. So I kind of wonder how much back dealing is and things like that, or are there other things that may be discovered where it's like, no, this is probably kind of pretty legit.
So this gets actually at one of the problems we have in knowing about the early medieval world. And that is that the institution that really dominates literate technology is the church. So we really only see many of these cases and many of these larger issues of land tenure through the church. We do have the king producing documents, and there is a royal chancery that is preserving and producing documents. So we do have a royal perspective too, but for the most part, we don't really have the perspective of your average person. Though, based on what we know, it's not just the church that can hold land in perpetuity. Really, anybody can. It was called book land, that is, land for which you held the deeds. The problem is, how legitimate was book land? One of the great things about dominating literate technology is that not only can you produce authentic records, you can also produce fake ones. One of the things those of us who spend a lot of time in the early Middle Ages spend a lot of time doing is determining which documents are authentic and which documents aren't. And we have lots of different tools for doing this. Most land that we have a report of it from multiple sources. One of our great instruments is Domesday Book, which is the great survey of English lands and survey of the history of English land holding that William the Conqueror produced. So we actually are pretty confident in our ability to determine which documents are real or which narratives are real and which are made up. But throughout the Middle Ages, this is an ongoing problem. One of the most famous examples of this, actually, one of the greatest forgeries of the Middle Ages, is what's called the Donation of Constantine, which is, it's a document that purports to be from the Emperor Constantine, the great Roman emperor, deeding the entire empire to the church. Right, on his deathbed, he's like, I owe you guys so much, you can have the empire. And actually, one of the most important moments in the history of scholarship is the moment in the 15th century where somebody named Lorenzo Valla, who is one of the very, very first serious textual scholars, he uses what we would recognize as modern textual tools to demonstrate that that's a forgery. Not that anybody really believed it anyway, but he proved it.
Thank you.
No problem.
I have what might be a very stupid question.
No such thing.
Well, I'm just curious because it's popped up in film and TV lately. Was trial by combat at all a thing at this time?
So trial by combat, it originates on the continent. It only really makes it to England with the Normans after 1066. And trial by combat is another version of the ordeal, right? It's essentially, we two are fighting, but the decision or the determination of who wins the fight, who loses, it's not who's better. It's the intervention of God. It's difficult to say how often trial by combat actually occurred, though. First of all, we know that it's something that only occurred among the aristocracy. So typically, if we think about, well, is there an imbalance of power? Often not, because it's really, it's something that people who have knightly honor do. So you're really dealing with only the upper classes. And when you have trial by combat, typically, if you are not somebody who is very effective in combat, if you're a child, if you're weak, if you're just a really bad fighter, you wouldn't go into combat yourself. You would have a representative. So you would get the best warrior you have. They would get the best warrior they have. But once again, as in the case of the ordeal, trial by combat is generally not used as a way of discovering who's guilty of a crime or to whom greater guilt belongs. When trial by combat occurs, it's typically, we know what happened. The purpose of this combat is to confirm that. And what that means is that trial by combat somehow always kind of works out. We find ways, the king finds ways, the judges find ways to make sure that the end is resolved.
I just wanted to ask about youth and what the legality was around children committing crimes, if it was based on some age, and if that was based on religious sentiments of age of culpability, when you can be baptized, those sorts of sentiments.
Okay, this is a terrific question. In part because something I've spent a lot of time looking at, and it's really, really interesting. So, yes, age is incredibly important. There are specific laws exonerating people below the age of knowing, which actually, the term that's used in the Old English laws is for men, wepne yahava, and for women, wef yahava. Basically, if you are old enough to bear a weapon, right, you're old enough to be knowing. If you are old enough to actually sew, what women are supposed to be doing, you're old enough to be considered legally responsible. Now, King Athelstan, who I mentioned briefly earlier, he's a little bit different than other people we've talked about. I said that people are really concerned about capital punishment. Athelstan wasn't. The vast majority of laws relating to capital punishment that are sentencing somebody to death exist in his laws. And he is, you do anything, Athelstan is going to kill you. This is his way of trying to make sure that, I have the power. But one of the great things is that one of the documents that survives attached to one of his law codes is a letter from the church saying, what you're doing is a mortal sin. You can't continue convicting people who are too young of serious crimes or crimes that aren't serious enough with overly serious penalties. And the next law code that Athelstan produced, he actually has to acknowledge in that law code, because I have been too harsh, because I have judged especially children too harshly, my laws are going to be changed in this way. So because he's particularly harsh on people who really shouldn't be judged as harshly, the church forces him, and very likely other aristocrats whose kids were getting arrested, he's forced to mitigate his laws.
Thank you.
In the two stories you told this evening, we had an example of our first character, Edith, and her husband, who were banished, and our second character, I believe, is John, who is sent to prison. Is there a time period in which this type of punishment, banishment to prison, is there a certain time period in which that shifts to being more, or were both executed equally?
So, no, they weren't. There was actually an evolution towards the prison as an institution. During the early Middle Ages, there typically were not institutions designed to hold somebody. All penalties were immediate penalties. So, you would be, have a limb cut off, or you'd be branded, or you'd have to be in the stocks, or be expelled, or, in some cases, executed. But they were all immediate punishments. You would be taken directly from the court to your penalty, unless you had some way of appealing, and there were ways of appealing. It's only in the later period that you start seeing institutions developing whose sole purpose was to contain those who were deemed dangerous to society. So there's actually an evolution towards that, which is related to, first of all, the development of increased legal bureaucracy, right? We can now have institutions that do this. We now have a means of governing those. Increased urban wealth, right? We can now afford to build these buildings out of stone and staff them so that we can preserve people. And the development of an increasingly complex legal structure that it starts taking longer to get from crime to court to punishment. You need to be able to put them somewhere. And once you start putting them somewhere, it becomes a really useful way of punishing them because you can put them back there for a certain amount of time afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I was curious about the evolution of court documents because you mentioned they could have records written in the one instance, the Bible, or others would be in charters. Where were all the places they were written, and what languages and who recorded it?
Okay, this is a great question because it's one of the things that makes England different than virtually every place else in Europe. One of the distinctive things about England during this period is that the law codes are almost all produced in the vernacular. So if you're on the continent, if you want to know the law, you have to know Latin. In England, the laws are in the language that you speak. And not all of the documents, Latin is still the dominant language for the production of things like charters. But there is a fairly large percentage that are produced in the vernacular. And there are also bilingual charters, that is, charters where the body of the charter is in Latin. But if you're dealing with land, the boundary clause, where actually the land is defined, because everybody needs to understand that, that'll be in English. Where are these texts written? Most of the time in the church, especially towards the later period. If you're somebody of sufficient wealth or resources, you start seeing the emergence of basically private scribes so that you could pay somebody to do it. We actually even know the names of some of them, the most famous one being a fellow named Adam, who was Chaucer's personal scribe and responsible for writing the Canterbury Tales. So you would go to them, or if you are the king, you would have people at court whose job it was to write charters. And one of the components of studying medieval texts is what's called paleography, basically the study of handwriting and what handwriting can tell us about where a document was produced, how the person who wrote that document was educated. Because people from different places wrote differently and had different, basically, kinds of calligraphy that they used. And so one of the bits of evidence about medieval life that we can get from charters is that when we look at charters produced at court, we can tell actually where the person came from. So that tells us about what kind of people are at court. So if you see somebody writing in an Irish hand, that means you know that there are important Irish scribes at court. Or if you see somebody writing, say, in a continental Dutch hand, you can learn the same thing from that. Now, the one other thing that I would say, and this connects to what I said earlier about forgeries, when you're thinking about what language these documents are written in and how they're produced, people are very aware of the danger of forgery. And so there are all sorts of technologies that are used to ensure that these texts are legitimate. One of them is actually handwriting. That is, the document will be written in so difficult a hand that only somebody who is an expert in reading that document, who was there when it was produced, can actually determine what's being said in it. So if somebody tries to forge that document, they won't be able to fake the hand. Other ways of doing it, they'll write in a difficult hand, and the document might be in Latin, but you'll randomly drop some English words in there. Things that somebody who's not necessarily as fully educated wouldn't notice, right? You're just sort of skimming the document, it looks like Latin. You wouldn't notice that there are English words in there. Or you might have a document written by two scribes imitating each other's handwriting. So again, only somebody who knows what to look for would know that there are actually two hands on that page, not one. My favorite is you could also incorporate secret codes. Spycraft in the Middle Ages is a fascinating topic. People would write, say, for instance, 2 copies of a charter on a single sheet of vellum, a single sheet of parchment, and then write between those 2 copies of the same charter the word cheirographum, which literally means written sign. And then the charter would be cut in half so that each party to the treaty or the agreement would get a charter. You would only know that that agreement was fulfilled when those 2 documents were brought back together again, and that word chirograph, which has been cut in half, is made whole. So yeah, the writing of these documents is really interesting. Thank you all very much.